Today's notes will be teaching you how to solve two-step equations. You should have done a variety of these in your past math classes, but this is more of a refresher, and I may show you some things that you haven't had to do before that are still qualified as two-step equations. The big thing you need to understand is what a two-step equation is and what makes it two steps. It's very simple to understand that a two-step equation takes two operations to get to the final answer. So it's not about how many lines on your paper that it takes up, it's the number of operations that it takes you to get there. Okay. The rest of your notes are going to prove to be examples of all the different varieties of two-step equations that are out there. I'm going to start you with the basic ones, and then I'm going to show you some of the more complex ones that is still classified under this category. Okay, so these are the ones you probably remember the most from last year or your previous math experience. If I have negative 7x plus 8 equals 14, the whole goal of an equation is to get the variable by itself, and we have to undo the operations in a specific order. It's basically reverse PEMDAS. So if the last thing you do is add or subtract, then the first thing you're going to do here is add or subtract. Right? In order to get the x by itself, the last thing you will do is detach the number that's connected to it. So we have to get rid of adding 8, and the opposite of adding 8 is subtracting 8. So you do that from both sides. Some of you in the past have been told to put the wall where the equal sign is, and that's perfectly okay. If you don't like that, then just make sure you're setting yourself up with everything lined up. The 8s will now cancel off because they make 0, and you are left with negative 7x equals, and 14 minus 8 makes 6. Right? To separate the negative 7 from the x, they are held together by multiplication, so you have to do the opposite of multiplication, and that is to divide. We will divide by negative 7 on both sides. You have to take the sign and the number when you are canceling out. Okay, so that leaves you with x on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, 6 cannot be divided by negative 7, so you have to leave it as a fraction, and your final answer is negative 6/7. Okay, it does not matter where the negative sign goes as long as you have one. Okay, but do not turn it into a decimal. If the equation does not start with decimals, your answer may not have decimals in it. Right. The second one, that looks a little different but still fits the mold of being a two-step, is x divided by negative 2 minus 16 equals 31. Again, we want to undo adding or subtracting first. So the opposite of minus 16 will be to add 16 to both sides. If you want your wall, there's your wall. Okay, cancel out your 16s. So you have x divided by negative 2 on the left, and on the right-hand side, do the math of 31 plus 16, and you get 47. Okay. To undo division, we want to use multiplication. We want to get rid of the negative 2, so you want to multiply by the negative 2. Okay. So we showed that we are multiplying both sides of the equation by negative 2. Remember, to keep it balanced, what you do on one side, you have to do on the other. Cross off the negative 2's. You have x on the left. 47 times negative 2 is going to give you negative 94. Okay. There's your final answer. Okay. The next one that I'm going to show you has a different trick involved, okay, but still under the same category. 12x minus 20x equals 128. You'll notice that there's two terms that have an x in them. Those are your like terms. We always combine like terms first. So this 12x is going to subtract this 20x. 12 minus 20 gives you negative 8x equals 128. Right? That is one of your operations. Even though it didn't take very much paper space, that's still an operation. So you might want to remind yourself to simplify first. Okay, and now that the negative 8 is attached to the x by multiplication, we want to separate them by dividing both sides by negative 8. And that would be your second operation to get your answer. The final answer is going to be x equals negative 16. So while it didn't take as much space on your paper compared to the previous two, it is still called a two-step equation. For the next one, I'm going to show you two different ways of how to do this, and you need to pick whichever way makes more sense to you or that you think you can be more successful with. It is going to involve fractions, so pay attention and listen carefully and figure out which one is more suitable to your style. 3 minus 3/4 x equals negative 6. Right? Do not change that 3/4 to a decimal. That is not going to be okay. You want to keep all the fractions in there or get rid of them in the proper way. The first way I'm going to show you is to deal with the 3/4 as a fraction and just let it go. Right? So that means that you would subtract 3 on both sides, cancel off your 3's. So now you have negative 3/4 x equals negative 9. Okay? And the way we get rid of fractions, remember, is by multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of negative 3/4 is going to be times negative 4/3. And you do that on both sides. Okay, that crosses off your 4's into negative 3's, which is good, and leaves you with the x by itself, which is what you want to happen. Put a 1 under the negative 9, okay, and then simplify your numerator and your denominator that's diagonal. 3 goes into 3 once, 3 goes into 9 3 times. A negative times a negative is a positive, and 3 times 4 makes 12. So your answer comes out being 12, but you had to be able to deal with the fractions. Right? The second way I'm going to show you is going to show you that you can get rid of fractions in algebra and still get the same answer with a little bit more success than what you might have had in the past. So if I take that same equation, in order to get rid of a fraction, you have to multiply by a common denominator or the denominator in the problem. The denominator for this problem is a 4. So if I multiply this entire equation on both sides by the number 4, my fractions will go away. But you have to remember to multiply everybody or the answer is not going to come out right. 4 times 3 makes 12. This 4 crosses off the 4 on the bottom and you're left with minus 3x equals negative 6 times 4 is negative 24. You have now changed the equation to where the fraction is gone, but you will still get the same answer, and hopefully with more success. So now you're going to subtract the 12 from both sides. You have negative 3x equals negative 36. Divide by negative 3, and you are still going to arrive at the same answer that we did above, and that's the answer of 12. So you need to decide, are you going to be a person who gets rid of the fractions from the beginning, or are you a person who can handle the fractions all the way through the equation? Pick a way and stick with it. Do not try and do a mixture of the two. Right? Otherwise, your answers will be jeopardized and it will not come out in your favor. Okay? So before we move on to the next example, over here on the left, I want you to write this note to yourself. Right? To get rid of fractions, as coefficients, because that's what they are. They are in front of those variables. You're going to multiply by the reciprocal. That's that first way I showed you. Or multiply the entire equation by the least common denominator. So those are the two versions that I showed you that you need to practice with and make sure that you find one that works in your favor. All right. So the next example that I'm going to show you is going to give you some more fractions, but I'm going to stick with the way of getting rid of the fractions because I think most of you are going to be more successful that way than anything else. So if you have the fraction 6/7 x plus 1/2 equals 5/2. Notice that all the denominators are different, so you cannot pick a 2 just because it shows up the most common. You have to pick the common denominator for 7 and 2, which is 14. So if I multiply both sides, all the fractions by 14, my fractions will go away. So you have to talk to yourself and ask yourself some questions. You need to ask yourself, how many times does 7 go into 14? You cross off the 7, and because it goes in twice, you multiply the top by 2. 6 times 2 now gives you 12x. Right, then you go to 1/2. How many times does 2 go into 14? And that's 7 times. So cross off the 2 and multiply the top by 7. 1 times 7 makes 7. On the other side, do the same thing. 2 goes into 14 7 times. So you cross off the 2 and you multiply the top by 7. 5 times 7 is going to make 35. Okay, so now you're with an equation that will have no fractions until you get to the final answer, and that's okay if they come back, right? But at least working through the problem's a lot easier now that you can deal with whole numbers. So at this point, you would subtract 7, and that leaves you with 12x equals 28. You're going to divide both sides by 12, Now 12 does not go into 28 perfectly, so we don't want decimal answers. What we do want to realize is that we need to reduce this fraction. So right now you're sitting at 28 over 12, but that's not a final answer. You would lose partial credit for giving me that answer because it is not in lowest terms. You need to realize that both 28 and 12 can be divisible by 4, which means your final answer is going to be 7/3. You do not need to worry about turning it into a mixed number. We do not use mixed numbers in algebra, right? So leaving it improper is perfectly okay, and it's actually preferred. Okay, but decimals are not accepted, and mixed numbers are just not necessary. All right, so let's take a look at 2 more examples under the 2 steps, and then you will be able to practice more of this topic in class. The next one kind of breaks the rules of all the 2 steps that we've been dealing with so far because it looks different, right? H minus 6 over 7 equals negative 10. Technically, this is a 2-step equation. It will take us 2 operations to get through this problem. But what you have to realize is that we can't do the adding and subtracting first because the top is trapped over the 7. So in order to get the variable by itself, we've got to free it up from the bottom. It's kind of like the top's in jail and he's got to break free. So in order to get the top free, you have to get rid of the divide by 7. And the way we get rid of divide by 7 is to multiply both sides by 7. And now you'll notice that the 7 is gone and the top is freed up. So you have h minus 6 equals, and then the other side is negative 70. Right? You just did your first operation. Now to get h by itself, you're going to add 6 to both sides. That's your second operation. So your final answer is h equals negative 64. And that's what qualifies it as a 2-step, even though it doesn't look like the normal ones that you're used to seeing. Okay, and the last one that we'll have to practice with, and again, we'll do lots more of this in class, right? But for right now, this will give you at least a running down knowledge of what's going on, are being able to translate from words into the equation and then solving it. Right? So I'm going to write the words first, and then we'll translate and solve. The quotient of a number and negative 2 added to negative 8 is 10. Okay, and you'll notice that all of these came from our word frame words, so we should know how to translate this at this point. Okay, so that was from our previous chapter. Quotient means to divide. We don't know the number, so that's where our variable is going to go. So we are dividing a number or a value x divided by negative 2, and then that is added to negative 8, and that is going to equal, that's what the is means, 10. Now before you go any further with this, you want to always get rid of double signs if you've created any. Right? So in this problem, this plus negative right here is not going to help us out any. We want to change it. And we want to rewrite the problem to say x divided by negative 2 minus 8 equals 10. And now we've got our normal 2-step that we can safely solve. You want to add 8 to both sides. And that leaves you with x divided by negative 2 equals 18. To undo division, we use multiplication. So we're going to multiply both sides by negative 2. And the x will equal negative 36. Okay, so now that you have translated it correctly, you have solved it correctly, you have the right answer. If you mess up in the translating part, then the solving part is going to already be affected and it will not come out correct unless you double correct behind yourself somehow. Right, so we will practice lots more of these examples in class and hopefully get you squared away to where you're ready to move on to the next phase.